went. So I'm going to try to figure out where he's at.
Jason,
Neal,
this is Neal.
Neal, where are you?
I know I have to be at the event, but I need some numbers. Can you tell me how much we did in grant making in 2017?
Are you serious? All right.
Yes, please, hurry.
All right, okay. Neal, I've got this on a big screen. It's really hard to do right now. Grant making 2017?
How much did we do in software that year in 2017?
Total. Wait, I thought you wanted just regular, I just thought you wanted all of grant making.
Yeah, but I need software, and why don't you give me 2018 while you're at it?
Oh my God, all right. All right, Neal, I've got this for you. 2017 software was, I think I have the wrong field up there. Do I have product value, people? I can't really see this.
Yeah, please do.
All right, 2017, it looks like we ended up doing, what do we have, 4.1 million, and then in 2018, we've got 5.7. Neal, you know that you can do all of this yourself, right?
I do, Jason, and that's why we're here today. Welcome to the cheesy opening of the event. I'm Neal.
And I'm Jason.
And we're with the Tableau Foundation. And for those of you who don't know, Tableau Foundation was founded in 2014 with a mission to solve world problems. And we do that by making donations of software, training, and financial support to organizations around the world who are using data because they have a vision for how data can really help them accelerate progress on solving some important world problem that they want to solve. And we're here today to talk about the living annual report that we produced now for a couple of years. And before we dive into the details, I'm going to spin through what the annual report looks like just to give you some context, and then we'll go into some of the details. So it starts with a cover page. This shows our total grant making since the beginning of time, so since 2014 for Tableau Foundation. We have a year-by-year overview, so if any of us have questions about different grant making over different years, we can sort by the filter and find the year and get the numbers we need. We have a Where We Work viz, and this is actually really important for me. I spend a lot of time on Capitol Hill. I spend time talking with politicians and other people around the world, and oftentimes they'll get questions, what are you doing in my state, or what are you doing in my country? And so I use this viz to answer those questions, and it's just lickety-split. It's updated every week, so it's accurate and current, and it really is effective in helping answer those questions. When I travel to Tableau offices, I also get questions from employees about what do Tableau employees care about? What do they give to through our programs? So I can answer those questions. And then both for me and also for external users of the website, we have this featured grant page that allows us to give more information. So you can do a little bit of a deep dive into the nonprofit we have partnered with, why we partnered with them, what we expect to get from the relationship, and so on. And then every Tableau office in the world gets a budget to do local grant making. And those grants are directed by employees. And so this actually will helps us tell the story. No matter what city I'm in where Tableau has an office, I can talk about the kind of grant making we do to support local nonprofits in that city. And then we do a lot of work with the United Nations. And so we thought it was really important to actually categorize all of our grant making under the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal framework. And this actually is super helpful when I'm talking with people in the UN because this is the way they view the world. And then lastly, our success is really due to the great collaborative partners that we have engaged in most of all of our projects around the world. And so we want to give recognition to those partners. And those are really like a few reasons I had for wanting to do an annual report, but Jason has a few of his own.
Yeah, a lot of the reasons that I had for wanting to pull together something that was a living annual report, which we put out on Tableau Public. I republish it every Monday to keep the data current, and it takes me all of about 5 minutes as part of my workflow to make sure that we have the most up-to-date data out there in the world in these visualizations. The big reason that we ended up doing this, it goes back to about 3 years ago. And 3 years ago, Neal and I were kind of just figuring out what we were kind of doing with the foundation. We were in the cadence of our grant making, and Neal asked me, so Jason, what do you think you're going to do about an annual report? And
I delegate.
Like all good leaders. So what ended up happening here was when Neal said annual report, this is what I thought of. And this image, this idea of the paper annual report kind of horrifies me. And the reason it does is I've worked with technology for all my life. I have very much been enmeshed in the digital landscape. And I didn't want us to go through the work that it would take to produce a paper annual report over the first 6 months of a year, go to the printers, and get it out by the end of the year, and that data would be for the previous year. It'd already be so out of date by the time it gets there. And pragmatically, I didn't want us to spend the money to do that either. I wanted to put that towards our grant making and other things.
And truth be told, for our grantees in the audience, I apologize, but usually when I get annual reports, I look at the first page, the executive director's letter, and it sits in a stack on my desk until I get sick of it and throw it in the recycle bin. So apologies, but that's the truth.
So this is kind of the mindset that we ended up having a few years ago when we started pulling together this idea. But it required one other really important element at play. And that was what our essentially reporting systems or our data stack looked like at the time. And often, what would end up happening is we would end up getting a request from one of our VPs, someone who ends up kind of working with Neal and oversees the foundation. He'd tell us, hey, sorry for the last minute Friday request, but I need to know the total grant making that we've done, total number of employees that we've had engaged within the company, and I need it broken out by the different types of grants that you end up having. And it's a little bit embarrassing to admit, but that type of process took me a full day to pull together. And so if I had something scheduled for that day, well, I didn't anymore because this took priority. And I'm sure, how many of you have encountered something like that in the past?
Never.
And so that's a little bit of a reason for our cheesy intro there, is that was my reality every so often, and I wouldn't be able to predict when it would happen. And so what our workflow ended up looking like is all of our data was fundamentally segmented. We ended up having product details in Salesforce, we had grants in CSVs, we had employee engagement in Excel, and the problem with this is we could never answer questions that were related to kind of the broader scope of our work because the data sources were so segmented. And so this was the forcing function that ended up allowing us to get to the point where we could pull together a living annual report because we just needed to do some data work. And the living annual report was actually a pretty easy kind of bolt-on to some of that data infrastructure work that we embarked upon. And so now, 3 years later, we're at the point where we end up having this shiny visual that's on our website. And I'll go into a little bit more detail about how we got there and some of the pitfalls we encountered along the way. But I want to cover a little bit about what the annual report is and what it isn't to start. When we pulled together the annual report, we intended it to be the type of document that anyone could take up and build their own off of. And the reason that we wanted to do that is we didn't see all that many good examples of these kind of live updating transparency reports out there. And if we were going to go through the effort of pulling this together, we want to be reproducible. And so that's part of what I want to share with you here. The core pieces of the annual report are pretty simple. So we've got a header image, we have header text, we have a couple of worksheets on here, we have some floating filters, we have a text object, and we have a footer and a footer logo. So all of these things can be broken down into pretty simple pieces. I would extend a guess that all of you have pulled together these different pieces before. You've pulled together worksheets, you've pulled together images on dashboards, you've put a text object on a dashboard. When you break it down, the composition of our living annual report is pretty simple. And one of the ways that we've kept it simple as well, just in terms of our visual design and style, is I've gone ahead and I've built myself a essentially template dashboard. And so I keep this as a dashboard saved within the living annual report file. And whenever I need to end up building a new dashboard page, whenever I need to put a few different visualizations and update the annual report with some new type of slice, all I have to do is I have to go in here, I'll put my content into this blank section in the middle, I'll update the image, I'll update this text up top, and there we go. Everything else is pixel perfect because I've basically created everything with this type of frame in mind. So not everything was easy to get to this point. So I want to share a little bit about some of the challenges that we've come to, because when I reflect on the different things that we've done to get here, it's really striking that we've come a long way. And part of how we came a long way here was through small iterative steps. And so share with you a few of them. This one right here is probably the largest and the most fundamental, and it's also the one that is the most invisible on the actual living annual report itself, at least the front end of it. So one of the things that we really did is we invested in our data infrastructure. And so one way that we ended up doing that is we decided that we were going to need to normalize all of the data that we ended up working with. We had all of those employee engagement activities that we wanted to end up pairing with the organizations that we ended up providing grants to. We also wanted to be able to see where our employees were volunteering, and all of these were different data sources that we were working with. And so we eventually ended up deciding to use Alteryx to end up doing this data prep and transformation. And what we do now is we end up exporting into a few different data sources that are hosted on Tableau server. So we have grants, employees, and then we have different specialized types of data sources. And those are kind of our master sources of truth that live up on an instance of Tableau server. And they power both our internal visualizations, which are kind of really granular, nitpicky types of visualizations, as well as external ones like the living annual report.
And I think an important point I want to make is actually you'll see up here that we still use Excel. And we still use CSV files. Mm-hmm. And we didn't go invest a ton of money in building a data warehouse or a data lake or all the fancy stuff that people talk about, because we really don't have that much data to deal with. And it didn't make sense, and it would have been harder to manage. And so with a tool like Alteryx or Tableau Prep or whatever other tools you want to use, you can actually maintain these sort of separate data sources, but then use the ETL tools to really pull them together and do what you need to do. So you don't need to make it more complex necessarily than it has to be for the size of organization you are.
And to what Neal's just saying, I mean, one example of that, we just brought on board a new technology partner of ours that kind of fits into this data that we end up getting. It's a new way for our employees to end up donating, and then Tableau Foundation matches those funds to nonprofits. And so we want to know about that, but we already have that kind of donation data source already in there. But with how we've set up our systems so that they're all feeding into a transformation tool, it's super easy to add new data sources in or take them out if need be. It's not redefining the entire architecture of what we're doing. It's just adding a new data source in and figuring out how it integrates. And on the center portion, you can end up using kind of whatever prep tool you want. I mean, Tableau Prep, you use Alteryx, you can use PowerShell, you can use Python. Like, figure out what works for you, figure out where your talents are. There are a lot of tools out there for this type of function. So another example of some of the small things that we ended up going through in terms of changes is when we designed this page in particular, I forgot one really important thing to building an annual report, that you need to be able to slice it annually. And so this filter up here in the first version didn't exist. There was one of those small details that's actually huge, and it had just gone over my head, and I had blindness to it because I'd been working on this page. It was my work. So when someone pointed this out to me, I was able to end up exposing that filter and then republishing it up to Tableau Public in 15 minutes. And so the ability for us to be able to make that change is actually really significant. I mean, it's such a small thing. We were able to do it so quickly, but the reason that we're able to do that type of change and basically catch something after it goes live is because we're hosting it online. No one has a copy of this printed out in their desk drawer without the ability to kind of filter down by year. And so as we end up seeing things that we want to change, we can push updates really, really fast. Another type of change that we ended up having was when we ended up doing a fairly serious redesign of the back end, when we started putting Alteryx in place, when we started doing kind of more sophisticated data transformations, I also wanted us to be able to change the way that the living annual report looked. And so we originally had a layout that was much more kind of letter-based. And the idea behind this, so these are 2 pages of what we previously had for the front-end visuals. The reason that we originally designed this in kind of this vertical way was that we wanted people to be able to print this report. And we thought that this was an important piece of being able to kind of create something that was a bridge between the old style of a conventional annual report and something that was digital. And over time, what we found out when we listened to our users and the people who were actually digging into this data is that no one was printing it out because all the interactivity was lost. And we knew that, but one of the things that we wanted to do was kind of ease transition into this style for anyone who was kind of unfamiliar or uncomfortable with it. And so over time, we realized that that wasn't so important and essential, and it wasn't the type of thing that people were thinking, oh, I appreciate that you ended up making this look like a regular annual report. And so this right-hand page here ended up becoming this. It's a little bit more vibrant. I mean, I spent much more time actually thinking about kind of the design aspects of it, and we ended up putting it into a broader format that wouldn't be as suitable for printing, but works for our purposes when it's hosted online.
I think the other point I want to make is if you want to go back a slide, Jason.
Yeah.
So one of the things that we started out with, what you'll notice on the labels is it's our programs, our people, our this, our that. So the framework for the communication out was really sort of us. It was our perspective of our work, right? So it was our programs. What we discovered when we were kind of workshopping this with people is that they don't really care. When somebody's asking me, how much grant making are you doing in Washington, D.C., they don't care whether the grant making was through our office program or through our mission grant program. All they cared about is like, in total, what's the grant making? And so we completely changed the perspective to be, what does the external user want to answer and how do they want to explore the data? And this is a really important point, is we sort of built the first one kind of for us, and the second one was for our stakeholders. And Jason will show you some of that shift here later, I think.
One of the things that I've taken away from the conference so far was from a speaker who ended up saying that she had this broad vision to build this data lake with a bunch of public and open data sources. And she eventually realized that what she was trying to do was she was building for herself. She wasn't building for her users. And I think that's what I realized about this as well, after getting plenty of feedback from people. So what's next for us? One of the great things about having a digital report like this is, I mean, like all of you probably know, I mean, you can change it when you want to. So you can add filters, you can add pages, and you can publish those updates out. One of the things that I really want to focus on is I want to focus on our storytelling here. I think that that can be improved through our living annual report. I've gotten feedback as such, and that's really the next stage that I want to end up improving within this type of report. And to that point, The feedback that we end up getting is the fundamental way that this report changes. If we were existing in a vacuum and we weren't showing this to anyone, it'd never change because we never get feedback about what's working and what's not. And so I encourage you, think about who your audience is. Think about whether it's your boss giving feedback. Think about whether it's your nonprofit partners giving feedback. Think about whether it's other foundation entities giving feedback, in our case. And sometimes your critics and your fans are going to come from unfamiliar places, and you'll be surprised by who kind of crawls out of the woodwork and gives you some really great feedback that you can use. That is my cat. So with that, I want to leave you with one thing. One of the things that we realized is that it's a little bit different from showing people this idea of the living annual report, and another is actually building it. And so what I've done is I've built you a template. This is a template that I'm hosting up on Tableau Public right now. It's also going to be included as one of the follow-ups to this session. This is just a TWIBEX that you can access. You can look at all the underlying data, which is all just sample data that I've ginned up. You can end up replacing that data. You can look at how the workbook is kind of technically built and how the page is laid out. Do with it as you will. I hope that you end up using it. So with that, I want to turn things over to Neal to really talk about the hard part of all of this. The technical part is the easiest part of this, and I think the hard part is truly working with people and convincing them that this is something that you can end up embarking upon.
And we say that a lot, that the technology easy, the people are difficult. And we also will say this would be really great if we didn't have to work with people to do it sometimes. But how many of you have actually, who build visualizations, how many of you have built one, you thought it was the bombest one ever, and you showed it to people and they were unimpressed? I mean, yeah, right? And how many of you actually feel like it's still a struggle to get people in your organization to even use data better and sort of move to Tableau off of Excel and other things, right? Well, one of the things that we've discovered in all of the projects that we've been working on around the world is that when you go to somebody and you say anything about data, the first thing they think of is this: monotonous rows and columns of data spilling off the edges of their screen that don't make any sense. But those of you who do visual analytics, you know something magic happens when you turn these data into this. Instantly, without the person having to do any sort of conscious thought, the brain is automatically seeing geography, size, location, and difference without even thinking about it. And in this visualization, what you're seeing in the upper map in the upper right is the prevalence of fistula, which is a horrible condition women get after a difficult childbirth, the estimates of where these women are who suffer from this horrible condition that's perfectly treatable. And then the variance lines you see, the black is sort of the average estimate the world has, and then the orange dots are the low and high. So what this is telling us is that in Uganda, nobody actually has any real idea of how many women in Uganda suffer from this disease, and yet you can see up there that Uganda is actually one of the bigger places with women who have women with fistula. And then you can see Mali at the bottom. It's a pretty tight variance, so Mali's got a pretty good handle on it. This visualization actually was a visit of the day on Tableau Public Gallery, and it's actually been used by Operation Fistula to get funders to consider funding the project to help find and treat these women who suffer from the condition. But these things don't go easily always, and things get a little blurry. And especially when you're trying to expose problems and lead, increase transparency. And when Jason and I were working on the Living Annual Report, one of the things we really wanted to do was push the philanthropy transparency boundaries. We don't think there's enough transparency in philanthropy, and so we wanted to see what we could do to just advance that and actually show it's not as risky and scary as people think it is. But what we discovered is actually going through, as a public company, going through our legal team and our executives, that they had less comfort with some of the transparency that we were aiming for. And so the lesson we learned actually in this kind of fight for transparency is, instead of going in with sort of a conservative model and trying to get people to move forward, we went in with maximum transparency And then our legal team and our executives sort of walked back a few things where they thought it was actually pushing a little too hard. And a good example is our grant making. You can go up and you can find out in total, what's the total value of a grant that we gave to one of our grantees. And that grant includes software, training, sometimes services, and financial support. And through our process, people were concerned. We had that in the first version, where you could see all those details. But there actually was some concern from various people about sort of the messages that would send to grantees and the questions that would cause and a bunch of other concerns. And so we walked it back from showing that level of detail to just showing the total amount of the grant. And even I think I remember even showing the total amount of the grant felt risky to some people. But we were successful in actually getting that pushed through to the second version.
And I mean, that's been huge for us. I mean, that is the core idea, that we are able to show on a weekly basis what happened last week. A grant that may have gone out the door on Friday, on Monday, that we can show, hey, we made this grant and it was for this much and it was to this organization and here's why. That's a scary thing for a lot of organizations, and especially for funders and philanthropies to be able to do. And so we've been able to keep the most important and really the biggest chunks in there, while dialing back a little bit of the stuff that was uncomfortable, but ultimately we kept the big stuff in there.
And we've heard from some very big institutional funders that they would love to do a living annual report, but they can't because the sort of calcification inside of their organization in terms of how things have always been done, and the risk that they perceive in being more transparent was too much for them to bear. So the other thing, we learn a lot in the projects that we do around the world, and this whole theme around transparency has become really interesting to us. I was in Zambia in April, which is where we have a project called Visualize No Malaria. And we've been working there since 2015. And I remember this moment in particular. I walked into the health director's office for the Chikinkata district in Zambia. It's about a 90-minute drive out into the countryside from the capital of Lusaka. And we walk in this office, and I see this white projector kind of precariously positioned on the desk, wondering why they did that, but they did what they did. And then the health director, she started walking through a PowerPoint presentation. And I noticed the young man there with the big smile on his face, as she kind of progressed slide by slide, his energy level kept rising. And then this picture actually captures the moment that she went from showing a few Excel charts and graphs to showing the first Tableau visualization. And it turns out that the guy with the smile on his face is a guy named Mr. Litia Mbanga. He's the data officer for the Chikinkata district, and he's their Tableau guy. And we trained him, and he was getting so excited because Tableau was in the house, and he was about to show Tableau his visualization. And that was such a cool moment. But we learned a lot on this project about transparency. One of the things that was built was a data quality dashboard. And you can see the metrics that the data get measured on in the circles. And so what happens is a malaria data person every Friday is required to submit their data for the week. Data go into an open source system that they use, and then into Tableau. And then we run quality checks on it. Is it current? Is it accurate? Is it on time? And calculate these measurements. And imagine being the district director who has a 20% data quality rating, and you look across at your neighbor in the next district, and she's got a 100% data quality rating. That has actually improved data quality. But getting here was a bit of work. And one of the reasons is that for a lot of people, data has traditionally been used as a punitive device, right? So data gets reported, somebody gets in trouble, and it's sort of this bad experience. And so one of the things that we actually had to do is completely reprogram people and let them know that they're going to show up on the data quality dashboard. But if they show up lower than 100%, they're going to get resources and training and other needs met that will help them actually improve their data quality. And it was remarkable to watch from the minute that this sort of went live and people were getting access to it, you could actually see the data quality trend improve dramatically. So the lesson here really is There's a lot of psychology that goes into how people think about data, why they like it or don't like it, how they think about transparency and safety and security. And those are all things when you're trying to sell your viz to somebody that you have to really think about. The other thing that we actually learned is on this project, we had our Tableau Zen Masters involved, and you can see Anya Ahern, who's a Tableau Zen Master. She went to Zambia. And initially, we got Tableau experts connected with malaria experts, and the experts built dashboards. And dashboards for the Ministry of Health workers to make better decisions about how to allocate resources. But the smartest thing that we did is we actually workshopped those dashboards with the actual users. And who can guess what happened? Every single dashboard that the experts built had to be changed. Because the way that the experts saw data informing their world was not the way that data informed the world of the practitioners on the ground. And that was such an important moment for us. So we trained all of these people in this room. We sat side by side with them. They got to use Tableau and actually customize the vizzes for how they saw the world. And what's happening today is they're actually using the vizzes. So the people who use the vizzes are the people who built the vizzes. And that was an incredibly important part of this entire project. And I have to, I'll share one stat after I do this slide. So the story really actually gets better because the users in Zambia built the vizzes for themselves, because they were so enthusiastic about using data and using the vizzes, their colleagues in Senegal raised their hand and said, we want to have vizzes too. And so we got one of our Zen masters actually translated all the Zambia vizzes into French. We trained the Senegalese, and they had fully customized Tableau vizzes, operational and ready for deployment in about 10 days. And that's sort of unheard of in this sector, to have something like this go into a new country and actually be operational in 10 days. And then, I can't share the name of the country because we don't have permission. We just went into a new country, and we trained everybody, had them customize their vizzes, and it took 4 days. And we're trying to get it down to 2. And the reason we're trying to get it down to 2 is that a child dies from malaria every 2 minutes. And so if you feel like what we feel like is if we have this intervention that is apparently helping, then we sort of have this moral responsibility to roll it out and get it in as many people's hands as possible. And the reason this really connects is that the southern province of Zambia, where this work has been going on, we just got new numbers last week, so they've had an 80% decline in malaria cases and a 90% decline in malaria deaths. And that's real progress. And data doesn't do all of that, but data is an important component of that particular work.
And then on the data side, I mean, all of this started from some really simple seeds. Started with kind of turning about that idea that data is going to be used punitively, and it turned about that idea that you have to have the experts building the viz for other people, but that in fact, what ended up happening that was most effective was people, those experts, ended up listening and working with those users to build what they actually needed and wanted.
And then one more piece of advice that I've actually learned as I've been traveling around the world and showing vizzes is that one thing I find is when I see the person who developed the viz show it to somebody, oftentimes what will happen is they will do a demo of Tableau. They'll say, click here, you can have a filter, and if you click this filter, look, the countries change. And if you click on this map, then you get this text box that shows up and gives you information.
And for all of you who are Tableau desktop users, who wants to do that when you build a viz? Because I do. I want to show off all of the cool stuff I've built, and I want people to see it.
Exactly. But what we've learned actually is that people who aren't into data, they don't need a product demo. They need to hear the story that the data is trying to tell them through the visualization. So when I do demos, when I talk about the work that we do around the world and I show vizzes, I never mention the product. I never talk about product features. I tell the story that the data is trying to tell through the visualization, and I help them understand the kinds of questions that the data can help them answer. And that makes all the difference. Just like we did on the annual report, you're changing the framework from it being about you and your work to being about what they need to hear to be successful and sort of adopt the use of data.
All right, so we're gonna put a bow on things and wrap them up. we want to leave you with some tangible takeaways. And so we have I think, 3 main takeaways here. The one that I want to leave you with is that this idea of transparency is scary. But all of the stuff that we've shown you, these are relatively simple Tableau dashboards, at least in terms of how they're built. The hard part is on kind of the people side, but all of the technical stuff, you can start this next week when you go back to your organizations. All of this stuff you can end up putting into practice, and you can start seeing what's working and what doesn't, and then you can start building from there.
And I think the one I wanted to really share was the one I just did, which is don't do product demos, really tell the story that the data is telling. And then the other one that was really important for us that we tell nonprofits everywhere is just get started with what you have. We're still using Excel and CSV files, so you don't need to have perfect data. You don't need to have a data warehouse. You don't need a bunch of stuff. If you can just take one Excel chart and get it into Tableau and help it tell a story, and then maybe bring in data from a different Excel spreadsheet that helps deepen the insights you get, that's a great place to start.
So we'll go ahead and leave you with one thought here. What's the one thing that you can take away from this, or even just more broadly, the rest of Tableau Conference? What's the one thing that you can take away and start doing next week? How
Jason's
can you
giving
put this
you
into
homework.
practice? This is homework.
You're getting homework.
And one thing that actually happened, we gave a session that was similar to this last year at conference. And recently, I got a note from one of the people who had attended the session. And she had said that she had started to pull together her own living annual report for her organization. And so she shared with me the link on her website. And she said that this is just a start, that there are a bunch of things that she still wants to build into this, that she has lots of changes that she wants to make, but she started with this. It's out there, and she can get feedback on it, and it's live. It can start doing things for that organization. And I mean, that's just, it feels really awesome to be able to see these things kind of get started and put them out there, and to maybe do that before you think that they're ready or before they're perfect, because if you wait for that, you're never going to put anything out there.
And we've had 2 other people come by the Tableau Foundation booth here saying that they actually built their living annual reports. And then there's someone in this room who's working on one, but I won't call her out. But what was exciting for us is to do this and actually have people walk away and produce something and then come back really proud that they were able to accomplish it. And not only proud because they created a cool viz, but actually proud that they were able to get their organization sort of through the change management process to approve releasing their annual report to the public. And they were super excited about that.
So we're going to go ahead and open the floor up for questions. But before we do that, if you have time, please go ahead and rate this session, rate all of the sessions that you end up having over the course of conference. It really helps us get better data to figure out what we want to put on the future and maybe what not. So we'll go ahead and open things up for questions. Here's our contact info if you want to get in contact with us. And we'll also be here all week downstairs in the Tableau Foundation area inside the expo hall. So questions? Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about how your legal team pushed back on some of the information you were providing? How's it been working with your marketing and communications team? Are they involved in the process to make sure your visualizations are aligned with your company branding guidelines, or is it kind of operating in silos, getting their approval, and then maybe don't like it, maybe they don't?
So 2 really good questions there. How did our legal team end up kind of pushing back on things? And then do we work with our marketing team on things like branding and the appearance of things? Do you want to take the legal part? Oh.
Yeah, mainly it was just around, it was all level of detail questions. So there was no pushback on just being transparent in general, the concept of it. Tableau has that cultural ethic anyway. But some of those levels of detail in terms of exactly how much are we giving in money versus software, they felt that was a little bit too much on the edge, and that's one of the things that we actually had to walk back.
And I think that some of that was there's actually a huge difference between what is what is sensitive and then what's perceived sensitive.
Yeah.
There's a huge difference in that, but in terms of the functional aspect of getting something done, they're the same. So if someone has that perception, you can work on changing it for the long term, but short term, I mean, it's something, it exists.
Yeah.
And then on the marketing side of the house, we develop these visualizations with some input from them. Ultimately, I mean, we operate really autonomously within Tableau. And so, I mean, as we develop new visualizations and publish them, I mean, all of that's stuff that we do essentially on our own. And we decide what we end up putting out there. But we do take into account, and if, let's say that I want to do a big visual redesign, I'm going to run it by some of our marketing people, not because I want their approval or buy-in on it, but because I want their feedback, because I think that they have a really good sense for visual design, much better than my own, and that they can help me with it.
Yeah, we didn't want to get stuck in the process, so we really were, Jason was really conscientious about making it clear we're not asking for approval, we're asking for feedback. And then one of the other things he did that I thought was super smart is once we have that sort of design element figured out, and he made the template, we can now produce multiple pages if we need to with that template without having to go back and get permission for each one. And then we know they're open and transparent enough, they will let us know if we're doing something that they don't like. But we tend to like do it, like ask for forgiveness, not permission, and that seems to work well for us right now.
I wish you all the best in that as well.
Yes, we have a question over here.
So I love the idea that you can tweak from year to year. I'm wondering how you think about what you might want 25 years from now to look back at your annual report, or if that's not really something that is related to that.
That's a good question. I think the thing that allowed us to get this going and to get it published and then to iterate is we weren't really trying to look out far and necessarily head to some vision. We really were looking at like, what do we need today? And then when I come up with something new that I need, Jason puts it in. So it's sort of an, just-in-time kind of iterative design process versus having a longer-term vision for what it might look like and then trying to head there. We do have a few goals around transparency. We hope we can kind of keep pushing that envelope a bit. But did I not answer your question?
Well, I think I was actually going the other way. So in 25 years, when you want to go back. So what I like about Tableau
right.
is that it's always your current
Yeah.
data. But when you want to look at that annual report from 20 years ago, we don't really want the print. So
Right.
if you're going through your files looking for something.
Yeah.
Because you might think about your work differently, or you might be tracking different.
Absolutely.
In different ways.
Yeah.
Do you have any sense of how you would keep this year's annual report held within your organizational history?
That's a great question. I'll let Jason weigh in too, but I think if let's say we do a complete visual redesign in 2020, right? Adam announced on Tuesday that, the company's supporting us with $100 million of software training and financial support. That's going to change a lot of how and what we do, right? So let's say we completely change the format in 2020. We will include all the data for all time and just restate it in that format. So we're not going to keep sort of snapshots of the visual look and feel that we have today. We're just going to flow the data into the new design and make sure that the new design accommodates for having a history of data. And what I like about that is the way I tell Tableau Foundation stories is going to change over time as well. And so the iterative process of building the annual report, I'll be able to tell the story in whatever current messaging I have for not just what's happening then, but I can also tell it for what happened in 2014. So having it in that new sort of framework is really helpful, I think, for that.
And I think that, there's one piece that Neal might actually not know about, is that when we make a significant visual redesign or a significant redesign in general, I branch it. So, my version control is like really bad. It's a TWIBX that's saved in a shared folder. But there is version control in the sense that, when I ended up pulling down these old images from the old annual report. Wow, we have a lot of slides. When I pulled down these images, I just went back to essentially my reference TWIBX to be able to pull this stuff down. But I mean, as Neal said, I mean, the storytelling changes over time, the needs change over time. But we do have a limited history of kind of what's existed on the visual sense.
Yeah. But I don't anticipate using it really. It's kind of
Yeah.
more for Jason's use. Yeah. Great question, actually. Hi.
So I really like the transparency and the getting the data out quickly.
Yeah.
But getting the data out quickly is the bit that I see the problem with from our organisation. So what challenges did you have in getting people to make sure their data was good so that you could use it at the speed that you're using it at?
A lot of the data that we end up having access to, it helps to be the customer. And so a lot of the data that we end up using that powers things is from an organization that we have paid them money in order to do something. And I mean, I can get pretty persnickety about kind of exactly the standards that I want this data to be contained in. And that doesn't always work in an expedient manner, but I mean, I'll eventually get it and I'll eventually set it up as a data flow that can update daily or weekly or what have you. And I mean, it varies a little bit. It's a hard challenge, but I mean, it's been relatively easy for us because we've been able to specify exactly what we've needed from people who should have that on hand anyway. And then when we've needed to kind of supplement with additional sources of data or needed to recreate things that we can't get from other sources or they won't give it to us, what I've done is I've basically just created small CSVs and spliced that data in using the transformation workflow.
And I think we haven't experienced this ourselves, but I think one of the benefits of what Jason set up, where you've got your data sources, and then every Monday you're just pulling it through Alteryx and putting it ultimately into Tableau. The fact that every Monday it runs and the numbers get updated correctly sort of allows us to just do it weekly without having to go and polish all the data every single time. So the fact that it's a repeatable process that is trusted helps. But we did, just in full transparency, just in preparation for Adam's big announcement, we had to go through and scrub our numbers because part of the $100 million is a $25 million equity gift to the foundation. And so being an equity gift, it's exposure to stakeholders and stockholders. And so we had to go scrub our numbers and just make sure everything was perfect. So if somebody wanted to do a deep dive and challenge us on how are we, like we hit 30 million recently, and so what's in that number and blah, 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 right? So we went through and scrubbed our numbers. There's a few things that we'll fix over time, just minor things. So that, what I was thinking about, I didn't tell Jason this, what I was thinking about through the process is you really have to build trust with leadership, and even the data is not necessarily ever perfect. And so you have to figure out, like, when you find that it's not perfect, or that the data have been flowing through your repeatable process in sort of a less than perfect way, what's the kind of ethical and responsible way to restate those data to be, as accurate and authentic and transparent as you can. But it's a lot of trust and just, yeah.
And to what Neal said, I mean, the answer to having slightly imperfect data is not to not put it out there. It's to disclaim it, or it's to make it as accurate as possible and like work for something better over time.
Yeah. But it is harder in bigger organizations, for sure. Yeah. Other questions? Patty.
So I have kind of a two-part question, so sorry about that. The first part of it, I'm really interested in the content that you decided on, and you said that you got feedback from stakeholders about, that informed what content you included and maybe what you excluded. So I'm thinking that you can, help us think through what we might include by hearing about that process for you. But also, you're in this unique position of being funders and being an important audience for nonprofits. So you might also share some ideas when you're learning about nonprofits and annual reports actually do come across your desk. What can you share with us about what content would be really important for a nonprofit to consider including?
That's a doozy of a question. I mean, it's a good one. The place that I started was, essentially, this was almost a marketing exercise in terms of like figuring out who my user profiles were. So who are my main audiences? What types of questions are they going to have? And one example of that is we operate a community grant making program that Neal showed you. And that community grant making program it's pretty local for all of our offices. And the question that we eternally have gotten, and we no longer get because we have this, is who have you given to before and how much? And those are two very simple pieces of information that nonprofits that are wanting to apply for our community grants really, really want and most of the time need in order to inform, should I spend my time applying for this grant or should I not? Based off of what I know about these organizations, are they my peer organizations or is the organizations that Tableau Foundation is funding, is it completely unrelated to the type of work that I do? So that's one example of a visualization that was tailored to a specific person based off of feedback that we had gotten, and it wasn't the feedback that we got from the visualization that was out there. It was the feedback of, oh, it's community grant season, and I have 35 emails asking, who have you funded before? So that's one example, but
and I think at the highest level, it was what we suggest all people do when they're building a visualization is who's going to see it and what question, and you guys do this exceptionally well in your organization, like who's going to see this and what questions should it answer for them? And so we went through that process with, Tableau executives, Tableau employees, grantees, people who want to be grantees, other funders. And so we just went through the list of all the stakeholders that we could think of and looked at a viz and said, will this particular viz answer that question for this cohort of stakeholders? Yeah. And then we actually we emailed the visualization out to to our grantees to make sure that the transparency that we were pushing for wouldn't feel threatening to them. Mm-hmm. Like, do they care that we're sharing how much money and software and stuff we gave them? And then we sent it to other funders and got feedback. We sent it to people like Lucy Bernholtz at Stanford, who works on data ethics and data responsibility, and we got her feedback. How are we doing on transparency? Sent it to a guy in Canada who works a lot on data transparency. And so I think my advice is you actually have to actively ask for the feedback, and you have to actually ask the right questions of the right people as well. And that's all very important to sort of pulling this whole thing together. And then based on what we want to see, I think for us, we're a little simpler, I think, than most foundations, but it's like, what are you doing and how's it helping at the highest level, right? We hate the whole administrative overhead thing, so all of our grants are unrestricted. So we sort of skip over the normal stuff that you all have to do for your institutional funders. We're really just interested literally in what are you doing, who are you helping, and then one thing that we really focus on, we're a small team, so we're only 4 people, and so we can't give grants to the little regional nonprofit that's helping 4 counties do something. We just don't have the bandwidth. So we're often looking for either is it an idea that if the idea is successful, the idea can scale, or we'll want to work with a network of nonprofits, like Strive Together, Feeding America, that by working with the network, we sort of have one contact and then that scales through the network. And we're trying to tell that story better so that some of the smaller regional nonprofits realize that we just don't have the bandwidth to do a lot of kind of mini grant making. Does that help?
Yeah, so it's kind of also where are you going?
Where are you going is important, yeah. Like what's your plan for scale? And the plan for scale doesn't have to be that your organization becomes gigantic, but it's sort of like how does this, if you have a vision for using data, how does this actually scale either through you or through others is a good way to think about it. Like the 18-city project you're working on, that's a perfect example of something that is an idea that starts and then potentially all cities could adopt it, right? So, yeah. Yes?
So I'm really happy to see you at your report, and I'm wondering if your data transparency, does that trickle down to your grantees, so make them more transparent about the data too? Is that a trickle down?
Yeah, I think it's such an interesting question. So we definitely encourage our grantees to keep moving that direction. One thing we're really sensitive about is the whole foundation grantee power hierarchy thing. So we actually try not to abuse our power as a funder and force grantees to do unnatural things. And so our sort of values, the way they represent themselves through this, is we want to set the example. And if grantees want to follow the example, we will provide resources and help them do that. We won't actually require them to necessarily do it. We feel that's like a bit of an abuse of our power.
I mean, the one thing that I think that we do want to do is we want to tell their stories.
Yeah.
And so when grantees end up sharing with us really cool stuff that they're doing, we want to take that and we want to amplify that as much as possible. We want to use the Tableau megaphone to push that out as aggressively as we can. And so in that sense, I mean, we want to share what our grantees want to share, if that makes sense.
So the only time we pressure them is if we think they have a really cool story about what they're doing with the data, and then we're like, please do a blog post. And not about us or not about Tableau, but about what you're doing and how that's actually advancing your work. So, yeah. Other questions? What time do we wrap up, by the way?
We wrap up in 2 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Any last ones before we break up?
I'm sorry, I was late, but you guys showed an internal. I would love to see some internal communication.
Oh, we didn't. I don't think we have any, but it's actually not it's not packaged in the same way. It's just a bunch of different vizzes that we access. We have one that we call the Panopticon, which when we grant licenses, we can see how many are actually registered, and we use that to just as a measure to say, like, if they got 50 licenses and only 2 were registered, that's just a flag for us to call and have a conversation and see, do they need more help or training, resources, and that kind of thing. But they're just random visualizations up on Tableau server. Yeah.
Anyone have any final questions or thoughts?
Awesome. You're free to go. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.